Hi, my name is Jeff Morrison, and I am an architect, and I lead the Unseen Underground walking tour. And this is something that I've been doing for about 5 years now. It started sort of on a whim, having worked downtown on Peachtree Street for a long time, and exploring the city on my lunch breaks and trying to learn more, comparing old photographs and old maps with what's there now. And one day I just decided to take some friends on a tour underneath the viaducts, almost as a joke, and they liked it, and people have been asking me to do it ever since. So it's a tour that I just give on my own, and it's for free, but the demand seems to really be growing. I never thought that there would be very many people who had the same intersection of interests as I do between railroad history and urban planning and exploring strange abandoned places. But I think that the particularity of the tour is something that actually really attracts people. We're here now in between some of the older classroom buildings at Georgia State University, and we're a few blocks away from the influence of the railroad tracks themselves, but nevertheless we're up on an elevated plaza. And the reason for that has to do with sort of a similar reaction to the streets that led to the viaducts over the railroads. And that was at the time when Georgia State was growing and trying to attract people to come back downtown. Was really at the height of when the population was fleeing out to the suburbs, and the city downtown was seen as a dangerous place, not the kind of place you wanted to go to visit, and certainly not the kind of place you wanted to send your teenage daughter on her own. So they designed this core of the campus really more like a fortress, with a series of large block buildings that then had these protected courtyards on the inside that were removed from the street. And then the courtyards are elevated a level or two above the ground so that you have a service zone and parking underneath. And as these blocks expand, they're interconnected across the streets with pedestrian bridges that actually have little or no connection down to the street level themselves. So they were pretty careful about establishing this pedestrian zone up at this elevated level that was intentionally separated from the downtown city streets. And that's the same kind of thing that John Portman was doing just a few blocks up Peachtree Street at Peachtree Center, where he was making these sort of idealized pedestrian environments, but they were all completely internalized to themselves and turn their backs to the streets. And of course this bad connotation for the city streets has evolved quite a bit in the decades since then, and we might attribute a lot of that to the work that's been done to improve the infrastructure of the city. So not only do we have improved security and mass transit, they just spent a lot of money redesigning Decatur Street, adding wider sidewalks and trees and things like that. So now we think of this idea of pulling away from the streets as really actually pulling life out of the streets, and these internalized courtyards tend to detract from the vitality of the streetscapes.
John, or Jeff, when was the this type of development, when was it in vogue, and when was this campus itself constructed like this?
Yeah, I don't know the real dates on this campus. Portman's Peachtree Center was in the late 60s and expanded through the early 70s, and I believe this was about the same time.
And could you tell us who John Portman is and what his influence was?
Yeah, John Portman was an architect who kind of made himself into a developer. And he started in Atlanta really with the merchandise mart, which was this idea of this basically a big box that had all kinds of wholesalers in it. Sort of replaced an entire commercial district. But it was extremely effective. It turned out to be a great idea, and he made a lot of money, enough so that he was able to continue that into Peachtree Center, which was really this microcosm of the city. The idea that there would be work, offices, and restaurants, and hotels, and recreation all combined into one megastructure that spans several blocks. And over a period of a decade, or really still expanding, he was able to make that a reality. And he did the same thing in San Francisco and several other cities. And as I mentioned, he, like the Westin is a great example of, from the outside it just looks like this 6-story concrete solid block that the tower sits on. When you go inside, it's actually hollow, and there were these fountains and lounge spaces, and so they seem really kind of unhuman from the outside and from the streets, but it turns out that his approach was thinking of the point of view of a person, but really sort of starting on the inside of his buildings, because at the time there was so little of the street complexity and activity to latch onto that he really didn't see it himself building within a street context. In many ways now we see John Portman's buildings here in Atlanta and in other cities around the country and the world as being out of date and very anti-pedestrian, because from the street they tend to have almost no openings and almost no retail facing the street, and really just large concrete boxes like bunkers. And they really were kind of bunkers in a sense. But having worked in Peachtree Center for a couple of years myself, I came to think that we honestly have to give John Portman credit for maybe destroying the city but also saving the city at the same time, because he was really providing an environment that people felt comfortable coming back to the city in. He understood that rather than just repeating the streets or working within the streets, he had to create these little insulated environments that would draw people back out of the suburbs and come back downtown. And I really think that that was the thing, at least in Atlanta, that started the pendulum swinging in the other direction, and that everyone has kind of built off of since then, and that 40 years later, almost 50 years later, has allowed the city's population to be growing again, and for us to really have a vital downtown. Behind me in that humble little brick building behind a gate, inside is what we call the Milepost Zero, and that was the mile marker that indicated the endpoint of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. That railroad ran from what's now Chattanooga, Tennessee, down to what's now Atlanta. The mile marker itself is a stone marker about waist high, and on one side it says W&A for Western and Atlantic 00, and on the other side it says W&A 138. There would have been one of these stone markers every mile between here and Chattanooga, 138 miles. And so this is a significant landmark for Atlanta because it was really the endpoint of the railroad that became the city of Atlanta. And it's sort of what you could call our raison d'etre. It's the reason why Atlanta exists is actually the railroad itself. So it was in 1837 when the railroad line was surveyed through the hills from Chattanooga, and a milepost or a termination post was set actually several hundred yards from here. And then in 1842, that survey point was moved to the location behind me. And it's, I think, a really fun story that at the time the land was being given out as land lots, really in a random lottery. The good news is you get land for free. The bad news is it could be anywhere in the state of Georgia. And they were doing that to encourage people actually to come into the heart of Georgia. And so back around 1820, I think, this guy named Sam Mitchell was living in Zebulon, Georgia, and a traveler came through one night, and they and really liked one of Mr. Mitchell's horses, and wanted to trade, and the only thing he had to trade was this parcel of land way out in the middle of nowhere in Georgia. And so Mr. Mitchell sat on this deed for about 20 years. And then in 1837, he realized that this new railroad was being built to within a couple hundred feet of this parcel of land he happened to have. So he approached the state of Georgia and worked out a land swap and said, hey, if you'll extend your railroad onto my property, I'll actually donate the land for the depot and what was then known as State Square, a little plaza. And so that happened, and that is why the end point of the railroad was moved about a quarter mile or so to this location in 1842. And of course Mr. Mitchell made out pretty well because of all the commercial development that happened on his property. And then the Western Atlantic Railroad took a long time to construct, partially because it was coming through the mountains and partially because it was publicly funded. And in the meantime, the Georgia Railroad was built to this location from Augusta in 1845. And in 1846, the Macon and Western was completed building northwards to this location. And it wasn't until 1850 when the Western Atlantic was finally completed. We had all three railroads coming from three different directions to this location. And that was when they set the stone marker that we see today. So one of the things that's significant is that it really marks the location that is the center and the beginning of Atlanta. Our very first city limits were in a circle, which is not unusual here in the South, but usually that circle was drawn from the county courthouse or city hall. In our case, it was drawn with the Zero Milepost as the center point. And to me, that really shows the importance of the railroad hub.